all for inviting me. I've had a lovely time getting to chat with all of you, and I hope that some more of us will catch up at dinner. I've certainly been well fed. All right. At any point, if you have a question, feel free to stop and interrupt me. Since we're sitting around a table, it feels far less informal, so that's good. I like that. This talk is taken is part of a chapter out of my monograph project that Brian mentioned. And I guess what I really, as I sort of started this project, I was thinking about all the DH hype and the subsequent backlash. I was thinking about questions about what is and what isn't considered DH work, and all the fears that sort of come up when you talk about digital humanities and tenure and promotion. And ultimately, I have to believe and continue to believe that DH is far more familiar than what we often see it represented as. And this project asks, really, what digital humanities theories, methodologies, and subjects are shared with traditional humanities scholarship. So what I'm really concerned with is in this field where everything is new and cutting edge, and people have talked about this sort of fetishism of the cutting edge, I think it's important to think about this in sort of a historicized manner so we know where we would like to proceed. And this talk is going to focus on my concerns about the digital canon, and this canon has really come to more closely represent a new critical era canon than a contemporary canon of literary texts. And I have dual concerns with this. I'm concerned that we have a number of these early, what I call digital recovery projects, disappearing, and we also have a number of projects that need to be completed that aren't. So there's sort of a dual concern. And just to give you a definition, to me, a digital recovery project is the use of the digital medium to bring a lost or non-canonical and difficult to locate text to a larger audience. While the original text might be available in a rare books room, these texts are not currently in print. They're not available in Google Books and not available in large for-profit databases. So I'm talking really, really rare, though there's many of these. They're not particularly rare, I guess. For this reason, this erasure signals a bigger problem than texts that are replicated in print and or online environments. All right, so to the sort of meat of the talk. Little background, I know we had a diverse audience, so those of you that know this already, in the 1970s and 80s, canon expansion was the literary holy grail. Groundbreaking scholarship, such as The Mad Woman in the Attic by Gilbert and Gubar, argued for an expanded understanding of women writers, heralding a new generation of critics that would bring previous excluded writers into the literary canon. By 1985, even Norton would publish a woman writers anthology that reflected this expanded canon. But scholarly presses had limited budgets, and numerous texts remained unpublished, rejected because they were deemed non-commercially viable. Further, scholars of African American, Asian American, Native American, and Latina literatures charged that the white feminist movement had not sufficiently attended to writers of color. Among the most influential texts that attracted criticism was the Gilbert and Gubar Norton Anthology of Literature by Women, which was critiqued for its lack of writers of color, divergent classes, and lack of pre-1800 writing. Scholars charged that the Norton Anthology had created its own alternative canon that was equally as problematic as the new critical canon which originally excluded women's writing. Margaret Ozell puts it this way. First, the canon was formed before you knew the extent of women's writing in the Renaissance and Restoration and other later periods. Second, the canon created has been constructed in general using the definition of literary hierarchies found in the male canon, poetry, drama, fiction, and belles lettres, and as we have seen, privileges some forms over others. One remedy to what was seen as a continued exclusionary canon was the launch of activist presses, such as the Feminist Press or the Kitchen Table Woman of Color Press. And these were launched 1970 and 1980. They were dedicated to publishing materials that mainstream and even scholarly presses were not printing. Despite valiant efforts by these activist presses and increased publication of lost text by mainstream and scholarly presses, it was clear that such efforts alone would not solve the canonical illusions. Dissatisfied, scholars and activists began to look for other solutions to solve the canon problems. So sort of next wrinkle to this story is in the 1990s, proponents of the internet began to tout the developing technological infrastructure as a tool to democratize knowledge. Popular culture portrayed the early web as this idealized, democratic, and free space to be protected from the market forces intent upon invading the open space theretofore dominated by scientists, hackers, and geeks. Advocates of the free web championed three ideas. Access to computers should be unlimited and total, all information should be free, and mistrust authority and promote decentralization, all designed to allow bubbles of information to rise from the bottom, sowing seeds of revolutionary change. Scholars, too, began to see the net as a space that altered power structures. Paul Delaney argued that the internet has thus mutated into an unforeseen and unplanned information space. Its virtues can all be attributed to its collegial political economy. In a word, its openness. Internet's most important features are its relatively small hardware investment, a weak but not ineffective central administration, little censorship, and an absence of bottom-line objectives. Its explosive growth in the last few years confirms the dynamism of a collegial cyberspace culture in which millions of users exchange information, collaborate on creative projects, and have their own say on any subject they care about. For scholars interested in challenging the traditional canon, the technological possibilities were a boon. We imagined that the free access to materials on the web would allow those previously cut off from intellectual capital to gain materials and knowledge that might be leveraged to change their social position. The new space of the internet would allow those who had been silenced to have a voice. Hypertext theorist J. David Bolter, for example, promoted the freeing power of the web-based environment as a space that encouraged the abandonment of the ideal of high culture as a unifying force. If there is no single culture, but only a network of interest groups, then there is no single favored literature or music. The supposed low cost of internet publication would also lend itself to using the internet to expand cultural materials. So you have these very, what we now know are naive statements, like Peter Schillingsburg in 1996 said, eventually it will cost less to produce web-based materials, and therefore one assumes to purchase a compact disc than it costs to produce and purchase Hans Gabler's edition of Ulysses. So this idea of it being cheap, easy, open, completely unpoliced, we now know is naive, it's unrealistic. Yet we had this as sort of a common refrain that was driving a lot of this early work and a lot of these early digital projects. During the late 1990s, scholars worked individually or as small collectives to produce expanded bibliographies and to publish recovered texts. And this is just sort of, I want to show the arc. These are obviously not all the projects, but I want to show you some of the simple HTML projects that I grouped with this idea of recovery digital text. They include such things as the 19th Century Bibliography Project, the 19th Century American Women Writers Web, Voices from the Gap, Early American Women Writers, the Black Poetry Page, the Online Archive of 19th Century U.S. Women's Writing, Modernism and Mythology, and many other sites. These are all developed by scholars without the support of the digital humanities centers, libraries, technological collaborators, or external funding. Some projects, such as the Charles Chestnut Archive, were positioned as undergraduate teaching and learning tools, with undergraduate students partnered in the production of texts. We also at the same time have e-tech centers, digital humanities centers, and libraries and museums interested in recovery projects. Projects include things like the Emory Women Writers Project, UVA's Electronic Text Archive, Tech Center, and the Digital Schoenberg Library of 19th Century Black Women Writers, and other Schoenberg materials. Some of these projects are headed by scholars, but most are run through libraries and centers. For scholars interested in reworking the canon, the web seemed this unfettered space that allowed the scholar direct control of what could be digitized and how it could be presented. Susan Freeman, discussing their Orlando project, which is a Canadian project, lauded this expansive digital environment, writing, "Now the guest list of history-making women is electronic, and there are always more seats at the table." The belief in the internet as a means to break the canon was likewise espoused by the editors of romantic circles. One of the strengths of web publishing is that it facilitates, even favors, the production of editions of text and resources of so-called non-canonical authors and works. This is in part a function of the relative simplicity of HTML and all the simpler document type descriptions of SGML, and of workstation publishing in general compared to traditional commercial or academic letterpress production and distribution methods. And I'll come back to this idea of it being simple HTML projects, because that's what most of these are. Very few are even SGML, which is the earlier stage to TEI, which we now work with. The ease of publication identified by the editors was what allowed the broad range of small-scale recovery projects to basically explode in this period. Most of these are produced through simple hand coding of HTML or through very early HTML editing programs like Adobe PageBuilder, if any of you remember that, and mounted on local servers. Ultimately, though, I think the thing to remember is that sites built during this period were largely labors of love, where scholars were interested in disseminating materials that they found varied and difficult to access, rail book rooms, crumbling newspapers, and other such texts hidden from previous scholarly examination. Such work envisages digital literary scholarship as a tool that might be utilized to meet the theoretical demands of scholarly work that reinserted women, queers, and people of color into the canon. And let me just give you some examples so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. One example is this really interesting site by groundbreaking feminist scholar Judith Federley, whose 1978 The Resisting Reader, a feminist approach to American fiction, did much to rework the traditional literary canon. She created this 19th century women's bibliographies project to aid the recovery of such texts. Very simple, very, very simple. This was housed in her personal website at the University of Albany, which she's now retired from. It includes several pages of what were then little-known literary texts by American women. These bibliographies and chronologies were developed in a graduate course that Federley taught in 1995, and then published by a student, Lois Dellert Raskin, as part of an independent study. Federley notes of the materials. Underlying this project was a desire to make clear to students that the texts available for such a course as this represent only a fragment of the total work of women writers during this period, and that we are as much in danger of developing a skewed version of American literary history if we look only at the texts by women that have been reprinted in the last 20 years, as we are if we only look at the work of male writers. In other words, the categorized and the marginalized can seem quite privileged when set in the context of a category that might well be called the not yet marginalized. The fragmentary nature of this material included suggests the importance of resisting this new canon. But I think the important thing for us to remember is this is an HTML site which has no custodian at this moment, and it is living on Federley's personal website from a university that she is now retired from. Okay, so this one I fully expect to disappear any day now. Digital projects also, of course, responded to the perceived weaknesses of print recovery projects. One of the most famous projects to do so is the Brown University's Women Writer Projects. And Julia Flanders, who's now sort of shepherding this project, says that it was designed as a direct response to the limitations of Gilbert and Gubar's Anthology of Literature by Women. She notes of the Gilbert and Gubar's book, she says, of its 2,300 pages, 230 were devoted to writing before 1830, and the volume conveyed the impression, both tacitly through its structure and explicitly in its introductory materials, that this history of literature by women had not really commenced until the early 19th century. The Poetess Archive, like the Women Writers Project, was constructed to challenge both the traditional canon and the revision of that canon by feminist scholars. Laura Mandel, who's now at Texas A&M directing our Digital Humanities Center, notes of this Poetess Forum. She says, if traditional literary critics demean the poetess tradition as not constituting English poetry, feminists, such as scholars like Miller, berate it for serving rather than contesting the cultural reproduction of oppressive notions of femininity. So you can see why these projects are kind of brought to life by these scholars. Other projects follow, just to give you a few. Glynis Carr's really impressive online archive of 19th century U.S. women's writing, which is included in the MLA bibliography, so it's made it there. We have the equally impressive American Indian History and Related Issues by Troy Johnson, and that one seems to still be limping along. And we have what's unfortunately now the now defunct Keele University Writing Black project, and I only located that. It's around only through the Wayback Machine. So many of these are just disappearing rapidly. They're gone. There's no indication that those producing early digital recovery projects believed that their work would count as scholarly research. The work was activist in nature, both in production and theory, often more closely tied to feminist or race and ethnic studies activist communities in which the individual scholars were engaged, rather than part of their tenure and promotion package. And this is a very distinct difference, I think, between this moment and the DIY approach in kind of contemporary digital humanities. One way I like to think about it is by tracking this movement through the rise of what I see as the intertwined queer core and riot girl movements during the same time period. It's another lens to kind of imagine these emerging ideologies coming from. These movements, the queer core and riot girl movements, emerge on the 1970s punk movement, and they're part of the DIY arts movement, which began to gain momentum in the late 80s and early 90s as new technologies, and by the late 90s, including the internet, began to allow self-publication and distribution of arts materials. As Amy Spencer describes the movement, it was equal parts creative expression and politics. The DIY movement is about using anything you can get your hands on to shape your own cultural entity, your own version of whatever is missing in mainstream culture. And for riot girls and queercore, technology and self-production of materials was the only way to give voice to the excluded. Embracing a personalist political approach, the movement's primary goal was to make visible excluded women, people of color, and queers, whether the exclusion was at a punk show, in print culture, in the classroom, or on a music label. These movements refused to rely on traditional methods of artistic dispersal, instead creating a self-publishing movement, often localized and idiosyncratic. And while I don't want to suggest that those creating digital literary resources were intimately part of these other movements, I'd like to suggest that the treatment of voice and power as it connects with DIY materials is very similar. The experimental impulse within the field, where individuals and small collectives could develop low-tech, high-impact projects of recovery that brought attention to writers that had not been represented in the canon, was crucial in the initial wave of digital archive production, and is what I would argue is sadly missing in our current version of digital work. In other words, part of this project that I'm interested in is thinking about how we reinvigorate the sort of activist DIY moment that I think we've lost as we've become much more institutionalized. Okay, the other thing that's really interesting at this period is that this work also made visible the growing numbers of scholars displaced from the academic power structure, our growing temporary workforce. Many of these scholars viewed the digital work as a means of bridging popular culture and academia, and most importantly, of reinserting the centrality of their work within a system that was increasingly exclusive. Kim Wells's Domestic Goddess is one of those types of projects. Though she designs it to talk about canonically excluded writers, it was actually also designed to provide an alternative publication venue where academic expertise could be demonstrated and community could be developed. Even if these scholars developing these sites were lecturers, cobbling together work at various institutions and by no means comfortably in an institutional home, the web allowed for a sense of belonging and purpose directly tied to their scholarship. And I think that's a pretty important early kind of movement, again, that ties to sort of activist ideas. Also, a lot of these sites are among the first that really defend open access. We think about open access as a fairly new idea in digital humanities, but when you look at these early projects, what you see is open access is core. So the Domestic Goddess Project, they say, I think it is our duty as teachers not to ignore the possibilities of making research easily available on the internet. If educators do not provide the information, who will? Do students have to pay for it, as a lot of encyclopedia companies are requiring now? Remember, this is the days of the CD-ROM Microsoft encyclopedia, right? This makes information only commercial, and even if they buy a subscription, sometimes the information they get is incomplete and encyclopedic rather than critical. These sites are great, but I want to teach for free. And this is not the only kind of project. We also see projects such as Kristen Mabel Bloomberg's Modernism and Mythology, and actually Sherry Benstock's Women of the Left Bank. And while both of those projects came out as print scholarly editions, both scholars developed digital companions to the projects. And I guess we think of that sort of digital companion open access approach as, again, something very new. We think of it as like Michigan's Digital Culture Books, which published an open access to My American Lit volume. We think of it as something that's contemporary to the Companions to Digital Literary Studies. But actually, you know, we have earlier scholars doing this very same thing, but they're building it themselves without their publisher, because they really believe in open access. So, really crucial. All right. But my real concern is that the early wave of these small recovery projects has slowed, and even more troubling, I think, begun to disappear, as is apparent from looking through the vast number of projects that are dead links, and if we are lucky, ghosts on the Wayback Machine. A survey of these early digital recovery projects makes clear that current digital literary practice not only tilts toward traditional canonicity, but that the early digital projects that initially represented the expanded canon have been displaced almost completely from the field. The displacement of such projects should be of grave concern to those involved with digital literary studies, as it is possible that we are in danger of producing a digital canon that is far closer to the literary canon of 1950 than 2010. Alan Liu's Voice of the Shuttle project provides a good way to measure the loss of these early digital recovery projects. Begun in 1994, Voice of the Shuttle was sort of a typical early project where you just found a bunch of hyperlinks that were of interest and compiled them. And that's exactly what Voice of the Shuttle did. He grouped them into what I guess he considers traditional humanities kinds of categories, and then would just continually update, you know, here's a new project, here's a new project. And it's one way that we can track the materials over time, because we have snapshots of this project on the Wayback Machine like every so many months, right? So we can really see what's moving and what is not. Here's the section from his minority studies component. This is his Chicano, Latina, Hispanic, general resources, literature section. And what I've done is I've poked around to see if I can locate these materials. Everyone with an X is completely gone. And what you will see is of the ones that remain, almost all the ones that remain are housed under the Voices from the Gap project, which is at the University of Minnesota. So even though it looks like we've got more than half, we actually don't. Because at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those projects are housed under the same project. So less than 50% of these projects are still online. And as you go back, you see this repeated and repeated and repeated. Okay? Other areas have a higher percentage of active projects. So there's more, for example, Asian American literature projects that are still alive for whatever reason. So we have these disappearing projects. Even of the projects that are still alive, they're sort of oddly preserved. And I want to use this Winford Eaton digital archive as one example. I've spoken extensively to the creator, this woman Jean Lee Cole, who's at Loyola in Maryland. And interestingly, this project is sort of indicative of these early projects. Eaton's a really crucial writer. She published Miss Nume of Japan in 1898, which makes her the first person of Asian descent to publish a novel in the US, we think. And the first Asian American to reach a national mainstream reading audience. Cole has worked extensively on her and published a 2002 book on Eaton called The Literary Voices of Winford Eaton, Redefining Ethnicity and Authenticity. But right after she published that book, Cole was working in libraries and found a huge volume of lost or unknown text written by Eaton. And she went back to her publisher, and of course what they said was, well, yeah, that's great, but it's not commercially viable. We've already brought one book for it. There's no market for it, so we're not interested in publishing it. So Cole was at the University of Virginia Rare Book School and got in touch through a couple colleagues with the eText Center, which was functioning there. And with the eText Center's help, she created a digital archive that they housed in Virginia. It included 23 short stories, 2 novels, and 13 nonfiction pieces, as well as an intro to the archive materials and a search mechanism. So pretty extensive revision of the writing by Winford Eaton. The archive is really interesting because it's very much a blended archive of this period. So it started out as a print monograph. It moves to an online digital piece. And then once she published it online, she realized that she needed some scholarly credit for this, of course, the tenure promotion issues. And so what she did was she excerpted a checklist of materials, a reprint of one of the short stories, and wrote a critical article that was published in Legacy. So it was kind of this back and forth between print, digital, print. So this project existed for a few years, but in 2007, the eText Center was dissolved. In fact, the eText Center had a real problem. They were actually severely hacked and lost numerous materials that were destroyed. And the eText Center basically got absorbed into the Department of Digital Curation Services at the University of Virginia. Now, when they were absorbed, several of their materials have been revised, TEI marked, and migrated, but not all of them. So some of Eaton text then, some of her text will be preserved and available through a standard search of Virgo, which is their library database. However, certain texts are missing, such as her novel, Miss Spring Morning, and the introduction of the archive and her expanded bibliography. They're just gone. They don't seem to be there at all. Now, I suspect that the novel may have been removed due to copyright, potentially, I don't know, because of the year, or provenance issues, but it is not available anywhere else online, whether it's Google Books, whether it's a for-profit database. There's just no way to get this text digitally. And there's no plans to digitize it. Further, the bigger issue is the dissolution of the archive. It's problematic, particularly in terms of representation of a non-canonical writer. The strength of a standalone digital archive that shows the breadth and volume of her work is really important. By transferring her work into single entry lines of a catalog, we obscure Eaton's work and her legacy recedes into the database. And this archive dissolution makes the recovered text invisible once more. And that's really what I'm concerned about with these existing projects. Now, that's not to blame Virginia, because they're doing what they have to do. They only have a limited budget. But what I'm concerned about is how do we as individual scholars help to preserve projects like this? Okay, while many of these projects have disappeared, we have still other projects, such as this Web of American Transcendentalism, which includes a lot of really important and unknown women transcendentalists. They're really the living dead. They've not been updated for years. They're in outmoded HTML, and they have no plans of preservation. The loss of a digital presence of an often reproduced canonical author may not impact the awareness and study of such materials, but of course the loss of one single digital reference to recovered text will, in effect, send the author back into the hidden archives that scholars have worked to expose. Digital humanists are fond of talking about sustainability as a problem for current and future works, but it's clear that we've already sustained a good deal of loss within our broadly defined canon. Now, what I'm arguing moves against current digital humanities trends regarding preservation. Kathleen Fitzpatrick and Matt Kirschenbaum, among others, have argued that digital forms are far more stable than most critics presume, and I agree with this. Forensic computing is able to recover data etched on hard drives, and viral preservation has preserved games, texts like Agrippa, even some of these recovered texts. So the one thing I found with the Winford Eaton material is that certain sites in China and Japan have basically copied her materials without permission, but they've copied them, and they've actually preserved them through this sort of pirating of the material. And when I told the creator of this, she got very excited. She said, well, at least someone can still see it. That's great. You know, I'm happy with them taking my stuff. Now, while we might be disappointed that Bethany Nowicki's early digital project, the John Keats Hypermedia Archive, has disappeared, which it has, we can easily access Keats material in print or even online. Whether it's good or not is a whole other question, but we can still find something. Access to the majority of the early digital recovery work I'm discussing here, however, is not possible. Few of these texts are in print, a few more are available on for-profit databases or on microfilm, but most are available only with a return to the one or two libraries that own the original physical copy of the book, journal, or newspaper. So the targeted preservation of such materials is not technical, as Matt Kirschenbaum has taught us, but social, and as a field we need to put such materials into the front of the preservation queue. All right, I want to sort of speculate on why such digital projects have disappeared, and I think there's a lot of reasons, and let me just kind of give you a few of them. Look at my phone. Excellent. There are a lot of reasons for the demise of these projects. Structural problems in the initial activist model have contributed to the rapid demise of the projects. I think that's one of the things. So hosted at a graduate student's PhD institutions, sites did not necessarily move with the creator when he or she left. I saw a lot of this problem. Where do you take your site? It's not that, even now, if you ask for server space, some institutions cannot provide it. It still remains difficult. Created in HTML and dependent on disappearing links, sites aged. Often scholars lost interest in learning new techniques that would update websites, such as TEI, so sites remained frozen with mid-90s interfaces and antiquated HTML coding. While credentialed creators were not necessarily trained editors and texts were at times reliable, the big one is copyright issues that emerged, as many new webbies transcribe materials and publish text without any clear understanding of ownership. And we can talk more about that because there is a sort of, reason to just keep pushing the envelope on that, but we can talk more about that in a bit. The other defining issue with these projects is that almost all were single scholar, non-team produced projects. In other words, most of these projects were born outside of the infrastructure environments that we now use for digital humanities production. Barriers to recovery are wide-ranging and certainly not technical only. Margaret Ezell's cautions that we have not revised the way in which we understand text, and because of this elision, certain texts, particularly non-canonical texts, are not being digitized. She says, while we increasingly have the ability to digitize any text we please, editors do not please to select certain types of materials, and this is in part because perhaps we are not yet changing some of the basic assumptions about what an edition does or what is appropriate. Clearly, the question of canon, what is included in a digital edition, is still with us. And additionally, we might have a historical problem in the very emergence of digital humanities that contributes to the selection of materials for digitization. Martha Nell Smith contends that the digital humanities developed as a space to which practitioners hoped to flee from the shifts in the profession that arose out of the cultural studies movement. In her article, The Human Touch, Smith highlights the digital humanities retreats into modes of analytics, objective approaches as the safe alternatives to the messy fluidities found in literary studies. She notes, it was as if these matters of objective and hard sciences provided an oasis for folks who did not want to clutter sharp, disciplined, methodological philosophy with considerations of the gender, race, and class-determined facts of life. Humanities computing seemed to offer a space free from all this messiness and a return, let me make sure I get her quote right because it's really good, and a return to objective questions of representation. So Smith suggests, and I think there is a portion of this, especially when you look at the way TEI developed and the sort of humanities computing, particularly in Europe, that there is a resistance to cultural studies constructions. I was discussing the 2012 Digital Humanities Conference, which was held in Germany, and it was titled Digital Diversity. But interestingly enough, there was no discussion of diversity but for a paper similar to this. I gave the same paper, and somebody said, well, your paper's the only one actually talked about diversity. Everybody else kind of would talk about, well, I digitized, a black writer, and then there was no discussion of race, just sort of tokenism. And I think that's exactly what we're up against in large part. Additional reasons for the exclusion of text are economic. There was an early hope that the digital environment would allow materials to be cheaply produced. Remember Peter Schillingsburg, and Peter knows that he was, that was silly of me. Unfortunately, this was never realized, and as Ken Price has so adroitly stated, digital materials might be free to those who use the project, but free stuff comes from somewhere, and it is rarely, if ever, free to produce. And Price, who successfully guided the Walt Whitman Archive through numerous grant applications, emphasizes that the creation of digital editions is expensive, and the demand for external and internal grant support always exceeds the money available. We need to reflect then on what gets funded and what does not, and to take care not to institute an even more narrowly conceived canon than in the past. NEH grants, which fund a majority of the digital literary projects, are often judged by impact, and impact is most recognized by numbers of hits to the site. We know that canonical writers have a greater chance of a large following than little-known writers. So, a good number of the archive and edition projects are not surprisingly focused on canonical writers, whether that's Rossetti, Melville, Whitman. And not only that, we have impact being judged by largesse of the project. And Margaret Ezell also thinks about this when she says, what is marketable in terms of digitization projects are editorial projects covering great, vast expanses of materials of varying natures, and that digitization in this instance sells because of its ability to include everything and to link it in a comprehensive, searchable, and sustainable system. However, a single, uniquely existing manuscript might be the item that gets lost in this approach. So you can see that there's various potential reasons for for, you know, the way we've ended up with the digital canon. But I guess I want to argue that it's important not just because of canon construction, but it's also important in terms of the new work we're doing, including data mining and visualization. We also need to really carefully think about canonicity with these projects. And ultimately, this idea of data sets, what is our humanities data set, is really crucial as we move forward. And here's just one example of the issues we might see if we're not careful about this. The UC Berkeley WordSeer tool analyzes grammatical strings, allows reading and annotations, heat maps, and word frequencies. It's a remarkably useful tool, and I think very highly of it. The problem I've discussed with the creators, and I think they're working to resolve this, but their initial data set that they've used to test the tool and the conclusions that they draw to prove the tool works are deeply problematic in terms of this idea of data sets and canonization. So what the team initially did was choose to examine the slave narratives from a very early project called Documenting the American South. They ran an analysis on the set to see if their question was, if the literary conventions of these texts corresponded with critic James Oldby's claim that autobiographical slave narratives include a set number of tropes. He says there's, I think, 12, including I was born, a cruel slave master, barriers to literacy. And he writes about this. It's an older article, I think, published in Callaloo in the 80s. So this is, for whatever reason, the question they chose to answer. However, this set of data that they chose to look at was really not appropriate for the research question. The 300 narratives labeled slave narratives in this Documenting the American South are actually a very mixed bag of first-person narratives. They are first-person narratives, but they're fictional and non-fictional, black-authored, white-authored, pre- and post-Civil War, some autobiographical, some biographical, some anti, some pro-slavery, or at least apologetic. And so they're really kind of not what they think they are. And of the narratives that the team utilized, a few are authored without intervention, I would say, such as Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative. Others are authored with a good deal of intervention, perhaps even manipulation, such as the Confessions of Nat Turner. Others have been proven false slave narratives, such as the narrative of Archie Moore, and still others are colonization religious narratives, such as the life of Jetta Osman. It's a narrative that convinced Elizabeth Peabody that she should turn to the anti-slavery cause and sort of reach the same conclusions as Stowe did in many ways, that colonization was the answer. Given the narratives, it's hard to believe that Oldby's criteria, which he says are to be applied to black-authored autobiographies, would be able to be proved by this set of data. As Oldby emphasizes, his criteria are indicative of a writer who is not fictionalizing. So ultimately, the tool cannot be productively used to answer the question posed because the data set's not up to the challenge. Literary data mining needs to happen, but we need to be very careful with the materials we're using. The most successful projects, I think, have been those that work with smaller curated data sets. So Tanya Clements did a wonderful analysis of Gertrude Stein's The Americans. That works very, very well. So it's not that we would need to dump these data mining projects. I don't want to suggest that at all. I think they're very interesting and great work. But we need to think carefully about continuing to build the data set that we work with, because without a good data set, we're never going to be able to reach the conclusions we think we want to reach. All right, so that's sort of what I see as the lay of the land, the problem, right? Let me sort of talk about some potential ways that we can stopgap or triage this problem. And these are sort of speculations. What we really need is a thoughtful, targeted approach to recovery and preservation. In other words, we obviously can't preserve everything. We can't target everything. But I think Dan Cohen's idea in the future of preserving the past helps. He says, worrying too much about the long-term fate of digital materials in many ways puts the cart ahead of the horse. Instead of worrying about long-term preservation, most of us, doesn't say all of us, most of us should focus on acquiring the materials in jeopardy in the first place and on shorter-term preservation horizons, 5 to 10 years, through well-known and effective techniques such as frequent backups stored in multiple locations and transferring files regularly to new storage media, such as from aging floppy disks to DVD-ROMs. This is pretty low tech, right? If we do not have the artifacts to begin with, we will never be able to transfer them to one of the more permanent digital archives being created by the technologists or librarians. I added the librarians, because we know librarians are doing good work. So, Cohen's argument lays out two crucial approaches that we might adopt to help to stem this loss of materials. We need to keep working on acquiring artifacts, and we need to work with short-term preservation strategies. I think that approach makes a lot of sense to me. All right, so let me give you a few examples in my last, and then I want to talk about some of the results of these works. So if Matt Kirschenbaum is correct, and I think he is, and preservation is not a technical problem but a social problem, then it follows that we should be able to address the lack of diversity in the digital canon by attention to acquisition of particular types of texts. So we need a renewed effort in digitizing text that occurs in tandem with these experimental approaches to data mining, visualization, and geospatial representation. And really I want to emphasize that recent critiques have tended to separate the two. It's like we're done with the data production, we're moving on to the more exciting stuff. And I think that this is only going to damage both efforts. Like they need to happen at the same time. Not necessarily by the same people, but we need to have both working beside each other. So we know that current digitization of materials happens in two manners. We still have the sort of individual or small team approach. Sometimes these are becoming bigger teams, but we still have the individual who says, you know, this is a cool set of material, I want it for my research, I'm going to digitize it. Then we also have our teams of scholars, technicians, librarians who are doing the more large-scale companies, for-profit companies doing the large-scale digitization. And I want to sort of move away from an either-or approach for this as well. We know that large-scale digitization, such as ECHO, EBO, there's a new, Yale is also doing a new supposed broad American project as well. These are really developed for broad representation of periods. These large-scale projects are crucial in that they cover large swaths of material much more quickly than we as individual scholars could digitize. However, we have to remember it's true that there are problems of data representation, whether that's dirty OCR, so we get bad searchability, or what's much more likely is the gaps within these materials. So Laura Mandel has written extensively about the limitations of ECHO and EBO, for example. And using ECHO as a prime example, we know that Gale likes to sell this as comprehensive. This is what a review of the Gale product that's quoted on Gale's website says. 18th Century Collections Online, a comprehensive digital edition of the 18th century microfilm resource, includes nearly every significant English language title and edition published between 1701 and 1800 in the UK, along with thousands of important works from the Americas, amounting to full text searching of some 33 million pages of material, a wonderful edition of primary source material to have readily accessible. Now, it's an important problem, there's no doubt. We all want it. If you don't have it, you want it, right? It's impossible to do certain kinds of work. But I think what we need to be careful about buying into is, one, that it's truly full text searchability. It's not. It's about 70% accurate. So Laura does a wonderful thing where she picks a keyword out of Pamela and runs it through, I think ECHO, not 18th century, so bear with me. But she runs this keyword and it doesn't show up. And she's like, it's on practically every page, but it doesn't show up because of the problems with the long S's, right? So the OCR is bad. And unfortunately what we see are people that think it's comprehensive, and I've seen dissertations where they said, I just ran searches through this database and I have reached these conclusions and I have the definitive knowledge about this period. And you go, no. And so we need to make that clear to people. In addition, of course, all these products have histories of using previous print projects, right? So we know that these projects use previous print projects which maybe do not have access to newly acquired materials, to expand in canonicity. And so we know that still, even if they're touted as truly far-reaching and comprehensive, they're really not. There's things that are not in there. So we just need to be aware of that as a scholarly community. And here's just a few projects that I think really help to model ways that individual scholars can kind of get involved and start pushing back on this a little bit. The Typewrite project, which is the 18th Connect project up there in the left. Does anyone know this project? It's really wonderful. Again, Laura Mandel's project. What Laura has done is gone to Gale and said, look, we know you have dirty OCR in your echo. It's not good. I can design a tool which will allow crowdsourcing correction of this material. So anyone can make an account. You can go, you can find a text, and you can begin to make corrections. The really cool thing about this, as part of the contract negotiation, as you all know, especially you librarians, these are very expensive databases, and many, many schools don't have access to them, especially smaller schools and our ones. She's made it so that if you do some corrections on these texts, you can download them and have them. So it helps to provide access to individual scholars, as well as sort of folding the corrections back into these products. So it's sort of a win-win. The other projects that are really useful, on the right-hand side, the newly released scholarly editing journal, which is run by Amanda Gailey and Andy Jewell, who are at the University of Nebraska. And what they thought was, you know, there's a lot of people doing cool little one-off digital editions. Wouldn't it be neat if we could create an infrastructure that they could publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, get this material online, and get it out there for people to use? So the first edition has, one of the things I've used quite extensively in my classes is Uncle Tom's Cabin. It has 4 different versions of the Topsy sections. So you can see the national era and then later printing. So you can do collations, you can look at the various versions of these texts and talk about how, you know, things like as surprising as one of Uncle Tom's children is originally named Amerikie, becomes Polly, but only Amerikie in the very first newspaper printing. Now that changes the way we think about, you know, a lot of things in that text. So there's sort of oddities in that text that come out, and these kind of projects help to nurture those findings. Ameka is another great project. It's free, it's open source, and it allows a scholar to quickly build a digital archive. Very easy. I've been using it with my undergraduates. It's a great product. So another thing I'd like to sort of mention as we're moving forward is that it makes a lot of sense to carve out sections of our class to do hands-on applied projects. And I have to brag on my undergraduates a little bit. My undergraduates I teach a digital diaspora class. It's a junior, senior level, cross-listed Africana Studies English class, and we look at digitization across the African diaspora. We happen to have a pretty good Black Radicals collection, and sort of beside that, kind of separate to that, we have this Alex Haley collection. And one of the pieces in there is this Alex Haley article called The Malcolm X I Knew. It was published in a unknown men's magazine, and not like a Playboy kind of magazine, but like a Guns and Ammo magazine. It's a very weird place. It's a very weird Cold War magazine. But it was published right after Malcolm X is assassinated, and it has a distinctly different tone and kind of political agenda, it seems to me, than the autobiography and some of the later work by Haley. So my students went in. We have these 2 versions. We have the corrections, we have the typescript, and we digitized it. We also have the note cards, various note cards from when he wrote the autobiography of Malcolm X. So we have typed and handwritten. And they do actually even challenge some of the wonderful work that just came out in Manning Marable. I always reverse his name. Manning's new book. So these are really important things. We want to get them out there so scholars can use them. So my students transcribed, they edited them, they did some basic TEI, and they're going to be published in scholarly editing. So I'm really excited about, you know, they love this project. They love this project. If you can find a project like this, they will get so excited about it. In fact, one of my students pulled a note card and it had a number written on it. She said, "What's this number?" I said, "I don't know. Go find out." So she did the poker and she came back. She said, "It's Malcolm X's passport number, and I found the place in the autobiography where he said, write it down." So Malcolm X told Haley to write it down, and he wrote it down, and we have the note card. And she was so excited and made that whole thing really come to life for her. So I think carving out these kinds of projects are really important. In my intro to American Lit, or my intro to digital humanities this semester, it's a senior level seminar. We're actually returning to Malcolm X's autobiography. We're using a product called Neatline, which is open source from the University of Virginia Scholars Lab. And students are going to create a map of all of Malcolm X's movements in New York as discussed in the autobiography. So we're starting to build this project, and again, they're really excited about this. They can see how these projects directly contribute to their learning, their skill sets, their understanding of the text. And so I encourage you to carve out little projects. Basically, we do once a week on these projects. So I encourage you, if there's any way to work with your special collections or some of these projects, please do. All right. The other thing in terms of, that's sort of finding the artifacts. The other thing I want to briefly talk about is preservation strategies. One of the great things I'm starting to see happen is that various centers for digital research, such as the University of Nebraska, is actively trying to go out and find projects that need to be preserved. So Nebraska took on this Radical Scatters project, which was basically going to disappear, I believe, off of the Michigan website, I think is where it was going to disappear from. But it had no plans to be revised. And Nebraska took it on and said, this relates to our collection. We're going to fix it up and keep it in perpetuity. We can also use existing projects like 18th Connect and Nines, which I'm part of. These projects have done a really good job of nurturing existing projects like the Charles Chestnut Archive, helping them to be revised and brought into this infrastructure, which preserves and recruits them. And individual projects certainly can follow these lines. So I am working on a 19th century Concord digital archive and have seemed to have inherited both the Emerson Society site and that long-dead American Transcendentalist site. I basically wrote the woman at Virginia Commonwealth and said, so what's happening with this American Transcendentalist thing? She said, do you want it? I said, yes. So what we've done is we've taken this HTML site, and I have to say both of them were a mess, and that's not a critique of them, that's just HTML from the late 90s is a mess. And we've moved them into Drupal sites, and we're stabilizing them, and then some of the materials will feed into the Concord site. So it's a win-win for everybody. We get more material, they get preserved, people can continue to use them, and that's exciting. So where those things can fit in, I think makes a lot of sense. We also have great examples, you all have a great example of what originally started as a print project that's moving toward digitization, and that's the History of Black Writing project, right? That you all are thinking about how to digitize this really important material. So I like that sort of symbiotic relationship between print and digital, because it really does go back to what we originally started with. So just in summary, I guess one of the things I really want to emphasize is that, to me, the neat thing, the powerful thing about this early period of digital literary studies that I was looking at is this DIY approach that scholars embrace. It was the sheer joy and freedom of bringing important text to the larger scholarly community. And as we move from simple HTML sites to TEI and visualization and data mining projects, as we move from very individual to collective projects to larger team projects, as we go from non-budgeted to these huge granting projects, what we're seeing is that fewer scholars are really working with digital textual recovery. And we need to be concerned about that. And we need to strategize how we can reverse this trend. Because we know that the canon we're constructing is a canon that skews toward traditional texts. And it excludes crucial work by women, people of color, the LGBTQ community. And we need to really go back to this original spirit of the previous scholars who believed that textual recovery was an activist part of their work. And they saw that the digital was a way to enact changes in the canon. Because if it is, Jerry McGann says, the entirety of our cultural inheritance will be transformed and re-edited in the digital age, then we must ensure that our representation of culture does not exclude work by writers previously excluded. We must recover the digitally recovered